Introducing the right-wing war on education, starring Betsy DeVos, evangelical Christians, and a few dudes who rented out strip malls, called themselves schools, and stole your public school tax dollars.
And on the third day, God created the Remington bolt-action rifle so that man could fight the dinosaurs and the homosexuals. Amen.
In this hour, we'll talk about how Republicans want to dumb our kids down and what we have to do to stop them. As always, leading the conversation is Patty Vasquez. But with her, we have Kirk Bangstad of the Minocqua Brewing Company, who is leading the charge to get rid of the parasitic voucher school system in Wisconsin. And a few fellow public education warriors he brought along to educate us. The right-wing war on education is brought to you by the Minocqua Brewing Company. Take it away, Patty.
You know, he has been educating us, as have all of our guests. Kirk Bangstad joins us, and I've learned a lot. I've been talking to legislators in Illinois the last few weeks about the program, the smaller program that we have, but how really aggressive billionaires and right-wing extremists have been in defunding public schools. And Kirk, I can't thank you enough for bringing this issue to the forefront and fighting for the students of Wisconsin, the families of Wisconsin.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I mean, we've done now, 5 weeks of this, Patty, or something? Yeah. You know, we're trying. The reason we're doing this show every week is because we just filed a lawsuit in the Wisconsin Supreme Court trying to get rid of parasitic voucher system in Wisconsin, and we knew we had to do that. We knew, part and parcel of that lawsuit also was to educate the public of why the term school choice is kind of a misnomer and it's a manipulation of the public, and because a lot of people think that school choice is good, and so we didn't want to just have a lawsuit that tried to overturn something that some people mistakenly thought was good. So we talked about the history of voucher schools in Wisconsin. We've talked about the nationwide history, who's funding this stuff nationwide, and it's nefarious. We talked to the teachers union. We talked to folks, leaders in the disabled organizations last week, and on why disabled kids were getting a raw deal in voucher schools. But this week, it was like an audible, because the guys who are with me this week, Brian Potts, partner at Perkins Coie, and Fred Melms, lawyer extraordinaire from the North Woods of Wisconsin, filed our lawsuit that we've been talking about for like 6 months now. Wow. And we finally got it filed. We raised the money, we did the research, we talked to a bunch of people. And so I figured we had to talk about this week from the horse's mouth, because these guys really spent a lot of time agonizing over how to make sure we do this right, because it's so important to the state of Wisconsin. So I'm going to pass along. So first, Brian Potts, he's a leader of our legal team. Could you kind of go through, the entire complaint? Obviously, we have a half hour. We can talk a lot about this, but obviously it's going to be bulleted points. But go through the complaint and tell us why you decided to choose these certain areas of law to get rid of voucher schools, and why you think it's going to win.
All right, great. Well, thanks, Kirk, and thanks, Patty, for having me, and thanks, Fred, for being Fred.
Irrepressible ginger.
That one. So I just want to start out, because I don't like to assume anyone knows anything. So I'm gonna start from the top. And in our country, we, at both the federal level, meaning around the whole country, and at the state level, we have three branches of government. We have the executive branch, and I'm just going to talk about the state side, but it's similar on the federal side because we're in Wisconsin. But on the state side, you've got the governor. That's the executive branch. They're the ones that are supposed to implement the laws. You've got the legislature, which is the one who's supposed to write the laws, and you've got the courts, who are the ones who are supposed to interpret the laws. Now, that's the basic structure, and it's important to understand that the courts actually have two huge roles. One is to actually interpret the laws that the legislature has written, about school choice or whatever. But there's another one that's even more important, and that is to make sure that the legislature is complying with this thing we like to call the Constitution. And see, the Constitution, there isn't just a US Constitution, as you've probably heard, but there's state constitutions, and they work the same general way, in that the courts are beholden to the Constitution more than the legislature, more than the governor's office. So the courts are the last arbiter of whether the legislature is doing what it's supposed to do pursuant to the Constitution. So that's the very basic law school in 5 minutes or 2 minutes. And so where we are now is we have filed this lawsuit to challenge the legislature's decisions, their statutes, the laws, the mostly, Republican leaning legislature has passed over the last 20, 30 years under the Constitution in Wisconsin. So we're saying to the court, the legislature couldn't adopt these laws pursuant to this Constitution that Wisconsin has had for, well over 100 years. And so that's the backdrop of where we are. And so when we went up to the court, we filed a petition directly with the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and we can jump into why that is in a minute. But basically, we're saying to the court, we want you to take this case directly. We're going to skip the lower 2 levels of courts, go straight to the Wisconsin Supreme Court and get a decision. And the reason we think this is appropriate for that is there is irreparable harm happening to students every day. As Julie mentioned to me earlier, you're only 9 once, you're only 8 once. And so when these schools are hugely underfunded every year, this isn't like, oh, we can take our time and fix this in 5 years and wait for the court process to play out. We think this should be decided now. So that's why we're going to the Supreme Court. But let me dive into what the legal issues are. What are we saying is unconstitutional? And there's basically 4 constitutional doctrines that we're suing under. The first one is that all public funds are supposed to be used for a public purpose. And I'll come back to that, but there was a case back in 1992 called Davis that looked at the Milwaukee school voucher experimental program and upheld it under this doctrine. And we're saying, well, circumstances have changed dramatically since then. So that's the first constitutional issue. We're also saying that this program they've
hold on there, Brian. Just make sure everybody gets it. It's pretty obvious to me that public funds should be used for public purposes, but that's not happening because public funds are being, in this case, in the voucher case, public funds are being, our state tax dollars are being used to give to kids who choose to go to private schools, which are not public purposes. So that's the main reason we're making that claim is I just wanted to build that bridge for people.
And we'll come back and get into more detail about exactly what that means. But so public purpose is number one. You got to use public funds, and that's not just Kirk's idea. That's that's the Supreme Court of Wisconsin has said that for a long, long time under the Constitution. Even though there's not a specific provision in the Constitution that says that, the courts have said it forever. So that's number one. The other one is, and this one is pretty easy to understand. In the Constitution itself, in the Wisconsin's Constitution, look it up. It's not that long to read. It says all the state superintendent who's independently elected, Jill Underly, shall supervise all public instruction. And so our claim is if you're using these funds to send kids to private schools, then Jill Underly needs to be supervising that. And the criteria that is in place is not letting that happen. There is no supervision by Jill Underly. So that's a claim that hasn't been brought before, but again, it's in the Constitution itself in Wisconsin. And so the third claim is this weird, requires us to get into a lot of the school finance formulas, but it's called the uniform taxation requirement. And that basically says if you're a locality like Madison School District, the state can't require you to impose local property taxes to pay for stuff in other districts, right? You can only tax people who live in Madison for, in Madison for things that are occurring or being provided in Madison. So that's the gist of the uniform taxation. And we'd have to delve into serious detail and put everyone to sleep to explain why the system they've implemented is violating that. And then the last one of these, and I'll throw it back to Kirk, is we also have the claim on, Fred, help me here.
What's the revenue limit?
The revenue limit. My favorite, the revenue.
one.
So if you all thought school choice was bad and the revenue limit is evil, it is literally the legislature has said to every school district in Wisconsin, even if you want to, you can't raise more money from property taxes than a certain amount we're going to say you're allowed to spend per student. So Madison can't raise through local property taxes more than about $12,000 roughly per student, even if it wants to, even if the people of Madison say, I want to spend $20,000 to educate my kids because I care about my kids' public education. The state, the Republican legislature said, no, you can't do that. And so what this is required is these local school districts every year have to pass an actual referendum on the ballot. So you see, and if anybody who's lived in Wisconsin has probably seen these on their ballots, there's a referendum question that basically requires a vote of the whole school district for the school district to be able to raise funds. So we are saying that also violates the Constitution for kind of the similar local taxation issues that we talked about, and because there's a long 1976 Busey case that says local school districts under the Constitution get to decide the education provided and how much money to raise. And so that's just been ignored by the legislature, and they put this cap in anyway.
Okay, it's mind-boggling that the Republican legislature is shaping it this way. So I want to know how and why we are going straight to the Supreme Court, Fred. How do you manage that process, and what's the logic behind
Fred,
it?
explain what the word is called and why we chose to do it.
So we're bringing an original action in the Supreme Court. And ultimately, we're choosing to do that because it's sort of the fastest way for us to get a final ruling. If we were to start in the lower courts, we would have to go through the circuit court, go through the appeals court, and then eventually go all the way to the Supreme Court, sort of no matter what. This isn't sort of the sort of case that's going to end in a lower court. So they're going to have the final say, irregardless of what happens before it. So it really just made sense for us to start there. And that's kind of why the original action in Wisconsin exists, for the sorts of cases where they're going to end up in the Supreme Court anyway. They're important to the state. There are huge implications to them. There's really, and the other issue is whether or not there's a ton of evidentiary argument. I mean, we're arguing about evidence, and we're not going to be arguing about evidence because everything we're arguing is based on documents and reports from the state. You can go right to the Supreme Court through the original action. So it's ultimately an efficiency question, sort of a sort of a speed of answer question.
Going to follow Wisconsin. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
yes. You just froze for a second.
I just froze. Okay, so
I have a quick question, and I don't know who can. I mean, I guess all three of you probably know this. Brian, when you said that there was public funds for public services, does the Constitution? I mean, you mentioned that that doesn't necessarily cover schools. So it just assumed that includes schools?
So let me jump back in because I think that's a great question and really the lead argument in our petition. And that is back in 1992, the court looked at the Milwaukee program that had 1,000 students in it at the time. They were sending $2,500 a student and it was an experimental program. And they said, it's okay under this experimental program for these public funds to be used in this way because of the circumstances. It's such a minor amount. They use the word inconsequential to public education. Well, it's not inconsequential anymore. It's gone up by 22,500% the spending, and they've changed the rules so that now basically the legislature has used school choice to defund public education. Their actual goal, and there's no dispute if you read these laws, the only reason that they would have been written this way is to defund public education. You could provide school choice without defunding public education, but they didn't do that. And so my favorite stat in the complaint, and there's a lot of them, and you should take your time to read it, but is that if one student in Madison goes to an independent charter school, that takes away state funding for 5 public school kids. How does that make any sense?
I hear you.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, Kirk. Go ahead.
Oh, no problem. No, I was just trying to explain the original jurisdiction more, but my internet went down. I want to change the topic to Fred.
Yes.
So we think we can win this case. I think we can win this case. I'm really excited about how we can win this case, but I'd like to hear why you think we can win this case and what you think the main defenses will be on the other side. Why will the other side, the right-wing lawyers, try to, what will they try to use as a defense?
Well, I mean, it's going to be kind of interesting because a lot of what we're arguing hasn't really been touched before in the arena of voucher schools. We've looked really heavily at this case called voucher, which, I mean, it speaks to a lot of what we're arguing, but it wasn't directly about voucher schools because it was from back in the 60s or 70s. I'm sorry, 76, I believe. It speaks to how school districts can be regulated, how they can spend, how they can be taxed. And now we're just sort of it was a huge sort of right. What's interesting about that is it was a huge right-wing victory back in the 70s. And now we're using it sort of against the right wing to save public education in Wisconsin was originally their intent to destroy it. I mean, ultimately, their primary argument is going to be that every statute passed by the legislature is assumed constitutional. There's a very high burden to cross there in order to get a statute overturned as unconstitutional. But the statutes are just written so carelessly, and they're written so, I mean, brazenly, that I think that's a hurdle we're going to be able to clear, because there was so much confidence when these were written that they were not going to be challenged, or that the Supreme Court was going to always rule in favor of the Republicans, and that there was never going to be a fair court to consider these things. And now that I think we have a fair court, and a court that's going to give us a fair shake, when they hear our arguments and they read our briefs, we're gonna come out on top of this, because these statutes and these laws were written very I wouldn't say poorly, because they were designed very clearly to defund the public schools, but they were not written in consideration of the Wisconsin Constitution.
And I wanted to follow up. That's on Fred said that for the first time in is it 30 years that the Supreme Court has actually not been right wing? That just happened last April. So a lot of these, so I agree, a lot of laws that are written in Wisconsin for the longest time were written probably carelessly, because they never thought that this would happen. And so that's another reason why we did this original jurisdiction. It was because we don't know in 2 years whether or not Wisconsin is going to go belly up again and hire another right-wing judge. And we only have a window that's guaranteed that we have a fair Supreme Court for 2 years. And so that's one of the reasons we don't want to have this case drag on forever and ever and ever, because the court might change in 2 years, and that would be a disaster.
Go ahead. Did you want to say, Brian? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just one other thing, and this drives me nuts, and it's inevitable in litigation, but the other side always cherry picks facts and spouts them off to the public. That's just what happens in litigation. And here they're saying, this is just going to kick out a whole bunch of low income kids from schools, and we're hurting all these low income families. And, while that's true, we would, if we were successful, there would be about 60,000 kids who wouldn't get funding anymore. But they're forgetting about the 10 times as many kids who are low income in public schools that are suffering and have been suffering for years and years and years because of these policies. And so it's maddening to see those statements, and they just make them over and over. And
I was gonna say that as well, because
it's 10x the other way.
Right, because there's we have somebody who without a profile picture, so I probably shouldn't even amplify anything they say. But you hear this: if public education was worth its weight, we wouldn't want to send kids someplace else. Only we've been diverting funds from public schools and weakening those programs, so that you would think that it's sort of like eats itself.
Yeah, it's exactly.
It's I think it's important to mention the data that came out last week too about voucher schools, where they scored, their test scores were significantly lower than the public school districts in Wisconsin. So they're really this whole idea that the voucher schools are outperforming public schools anyway is nonsense, because sort of objectively they aren't.
And that's not just in Wisconsin; that's everywhere.
Yeah. Well, certainly
Indiana,
the Wisconsin
Louisiana
data was new, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's three from the political side. There's three white right-wing groups in Wisconsin that have come out and said that we're hurting poor kids. It's the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty, which is the right-wing law firm that gets into all this stuff all the time. It's People for Choice, which is like the actual lobbying group for school choice, and then Americans for Prosperity. Just imagine that you try to get Americans for Prosperity, which is the Koch brothers, like super PAC. And I get it. I'm a super PAC too, but it's called Dark Money Meant for Good, not Dark Money Meant for Bad. But the Koch brothers, they were interviewed they were quoted in the Milwaukee Journal saying we're gonna take the rug out from poor kids. I'm like, Americans for Prosperity. Why are we even asking them for an opinion? I mean, these guys are like evil. I wasn't happy. I wrote the reporter for the Milwaukee Journal about that one. I was like, really? Americans for Prosperity? Great.
Yeah, really. We actually are. I think it's we're taking a break. Brian, Fred, do you want to share any last thoughts before we bring in our next guests in the next half hour?
I mean, I could share. Really, this isn't about choice. It's about the cancer that they put on our public school system. That's our first line in the brief, and that's true. And under the guise of creating choice, they've created a cancer on our public schools, and we've got to get rid of it.
Well, I hope that you were drinking a lot of woke coffee to keep you going, and then relaxing with some progressive brews. How about you, Fred? Do you want to share any last thoughts before we bring in our next guest?
I think Brian really covered it there. These things the voucher programs are destructive. They're not meant to. I mean, they sort of only secondarily fund voucher education. They were clearly designed to defund public education and privatize public education throughout all of Wisconsin. This is not about are private schools good or bad, are vouchers good or bad. It's about whether or not the state's going to continue having public education in the traditional sense.
Well, thank you for slaying the dragons, you guys. I wish you all the very best. Rest up. We're going to continue our conversation in just a moment. It's the right-wing war on education. Kirk Bangstead is leading the charge. We've been talking to Brian Potts and Frederick Melms, and we're going to be joined in a moment by Charles Uphoff and Julie Underwood when we come back.
Won't you let me die?
And now back to the right-wing war on education.
We are back.
I vetoed that hard.
Kirk, it's okay. We're pulling the curtain back on the Facebook live stream. By the way, we are Facebook live streaming our conversation, the right-wing war on public education. Kirk Bangstead, the mastermind behind Minocqua Brewing Company is leading the charge. And joining us now, we have Frederick Melms, who's one of the lawyers who is going to be fighting this in front of the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. Before we introduce our next guest, I didn't ask you this before, Fred. How many cases have you brought to the Supreme Court of in Wisconsin?
This is actually my second.
All right.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. So the first one, they yelled at me for bringing to them and told me to go away.
Oh, this will not happen this time, Fred. I got a good
Felt
feeling
getting
about this.
bench slapped. That's what happened.
Outstanding. Kirk, introduce our next guest, will you, please?
All right. So one guest we've had on many times, and it's Professor Julie Underwood, who not only was one of the first people I called when we started this whole endeavor to overturn voucher schools, and she's been guiding us along the way, but because she's retired, and so she no longer has her, she doesn't have her like certificate of I'm a lawyer now because she's retired. So she was able to be a plaintiff on this case, and that was so wonderful because she's been fighting for most of her career against voucher schools, and so having her as a plaintiff, because basically anybody being plaintiff in Wisconsin, because it's a tax issue. If you're a taxpayer in Wisconsin, you can be a plaintiff in this case. So we have. It's funny. It's the name of this case is called Underwood versus Voss, and because we're suing Robin Voss, we're suing like the legislature, the Department of Public Instruction, but the first named defendant is Robin Voss, and that dude is evil. He's about as evil as it gets in Wisconsin, and we have Underwood, who's about as good as it gets in Wisconsin. So we have a good versus evil lawsuit thing going on here. It's great. So that's Julie. She's going to talk about why she became a plaintiff. That's what the whole half hour is for. We have more plaintiffs. I'm going to have Julie say who those other plaintiffs are, but Charlie Uphoff, another plaintiff, and we'll get to him in a second. But Julie, let's go. Other plaintiffs are in this case, and then go into a story on why you wanted to be a plaintiff.
Sure. I'm going to thank you very much for having me back on. And actually, Kirk, thank you very much for your willingness to be the champion on this fight against vouchers. It wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't be happening if it weren't for you and your commitment to public schools. So thank you very much. Publicly, for the record, there it is. But I want to actually, I want to look at my list. So I have to use my notes, Patty. Kirk's frozen for a second here.
I know.
But I need to use my notes. So it's Julie Underwood, Charles Uphoff, who's with us tonight, Randy Wendt, Father Tom Mueller, Angela Rappel, Dustin Imray, and Scott Walker. And it's not the Scott Walker that you may have heard of. It's a Scott Walker who's a physician, not the former governor of the state of Wisconsin. So these are people from across the state of Wisconsin. And we're just people who think that this voucher program is evil, and we think this voucher program is unconstitutional.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Patty.
No, I love that the folks are able to sign on to this, and how did you gather these folks, as far as like people who you've worked with? These are folks who have been at the forefront of this battle.
Well, I'll tell you about a few of them. So Charlie Uphoff, who you'll hear from himself, has done a lot of his own research on school vouchers, and he's been a progressive political operative in the state of Wisconsin for a long time. And I know he was committed to this issue. So that's great. And I won't go through everybody because people can tell their own stories too. But Angela Rappel is in Milwaukee, and she works with families with children with disabilities in the Milwaukee schools. And I think her story is a really important one, like we heard last week from your guest from last week. And Father Tom Mueller is an interesting one because Father Tom Mueller is from Milwaukee. He's politically active in the city of Milwaukee, and he has been involved in these voucher cases all along. He was particularly active in the voucher case in the Wisconsin Supreme Court that was challenging the use of money going into religious schools. And he is a minister. He's a minister in Milwaukee. So that's kind of, a thumbnail sketch of some of them.
The other two were basically Randy Wendt is a guy who's who I knew in Minocqua, who's got a heart of gold, who was a school counselor, but also a policeman.
Yeah.
He's done a lot of stuff in Minocqua. He was always very politically active, and I called him up and I was like, "Listen, we need representatives from the North Woods of Wisconsin for this thing too." And he loved it because he's hated voucher schools for 30 years and he's always advocated for public schools. And so he was a perfect guy. And then another person just came in over our Facebook page. He was a physician from like Prairie du Chien, right?
Prairie du Chien.
And his kid is he had an eighth grade daughter in the public schools, and he hated what was happening to the public schools in the state of Wisconsin. So he volunteered.
And I know that Charles has 2 grandchildren, yes, in the Madison School District?
You bet. Yes.
So tell us a little bit about your background. I know that you have been working on this for quite a while about how they've been siphoning off funding from public schools, and you've been very active and actually worked with the governor of Wisconsin's conference on this for family and kids.
Yeah,
correct?
actually, I was on the Oregon School Board for 12 years, retired now, but as Julie mentioned, I have a couple grandkids in the Madison public school system, and very concerned about the issue of fairness, in particular, looking at the damage that has been done to our public education by the private voucher program. The disparity between the funding that's provided for public schools per K-8 student and what is guaranteed for a private voucher school student in some districts is in excess of $8,000. That just seems crazy to me.
That's mind-boggling.
One example too, I mean, the argument's been made that presumably taking away vouchers is going to be an assault on poor kids. Well, in Bayfield, Wisconsin, that school district, the median household income is less than the state's average, half the state's average. And on top of that, 100% of their kids are eligible for free and reduced lunch, but they get $5,970 less per K-8 student in a public school than is guaranteed for a private school. That makes no sense.
Not at all.
Charlie, why did you want to be a plaintiff in this case, other than the fact that Julie called you?
Partly, it goes back to 2010 with the defunding of education, basically a huge cut. And when I'm asked who I'm voting for, I usually say I'm voting for my kids and my grandkids. And that's really what it comes down to. I mean, if we're not making the kind of important investments in education, we're shortchanging our future for our state, for our kids. And as I think was mentioned earlier, you're only 8 or 9 once. And if we don't have a quality education, I mean, nationally, we've had a real problem with teacher shortages. A significant part of the fact is that funding for public education has been cut back so severely. And I think nationally, they're talking about 300,000 teachers vacancies that need to be filled. Unless we're providing adequate support in Wisconsin and around the country for our public education, those problems are going to continue. They're talking about lowering the standards for teachers. That has a significant impact on our kids and our grandkids who are in public schools because there are programs and teachers that are being cut, and that has a lifetime impact.
Julie, what's your sense of this drive, this absolute focus on defunding public education? Because I know they're also diminishing the funding for the University of Wisconsin. I mean, it doesn't seem to be any benefit to the state of Wisconsin, except for their own agenda.
My own answer is immediately knee-jerk answer is just hateful spite. Really just hateful spite. But, in terms of the defunding public education, we know that that's gone back years and years. When we looked at the ALEC documents with ALEC exposed, the American Legislative Exchange Council, when those documents were exposed, one of their very first agenda items was to basically destroy public education. And the original documents, which I had in my hands, the original documents said that they wanted to make sure that kids could go wherever they wanted to. They wanted literally a voucher in every backpack, because that would then make school districts unnecessary, and you wouldn't have publicly elected school boards. And they were in favor of both of those things. They really didn't want their kids to go with the others, with everybody else. And they said that since public schools met the needs of everyone, they really couldn't meet the needs of your families. And so
it's really the big, yeah. I was going to say, Julie, it's sort of an educational apartheid.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing we are in a moment right now, and more so than ever that I've ever witnessed, and I think we all can agree, where when you speak up against this kind of extremism on the right wing, there's a lot of backlash. Fred, are you worried about how the plaintiffs might be treated, like they might get harassed or death threats, which is horrifying to even think about when we're talking about education? But do you have concerns?
Well, the sort of the MAGA right are the whiniest of snowflakes, to be sure. I would imagine it's not going to get that bad. I mean, people are going to write nasty things. Someone compared Kirk to George Wallace the other day, and what Will did. I mean, that's going to be the extent of it. I don't think it's going to go any further than that. Just because we're going to the court, people generally have some, level of decorum there, and the people who are, the sorts of people who are going to make a death threat are not probably capable of, paying that close of attention to what's going on here. It's a little above their heads, so I'm not worried about them at all.
Hey, Patty,
go ahead,
Patty. Can we go back to your question of why do you think, what's the motivation here? I gave a flippant answer to begin with, but honestly, I believe that the extreme right truly believes that if they get theirs and they take care of their own children, that's all they need. And so I've got mine, I don't care about yours. And they don't think about building the future for all of us. They're much more interested in making sure that their own wealth is passed down to their own children. And, the rest of you fight for yourself, which is really, destructive to a community, and is completely opposite to what the purpose of public schools are, because the purpose of public schools is to make sure that everyone is educated. That's why every state constitution has an education clause requiring public schools. Everyone needs to be educated for the benefit of everyone and for the benefit of our future, our communities, even our businesses, and our democracy. So it's really short-sighted, and it's really, I guess, just selfish thinking.
That's my sense.
I'm really fond of a quote from the late Paul Wellstone: "We all do better when we all do better."
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think really that speaks to the whole purpose of public purpose of education, is that we all do better with a well-educated populace, with children and voters. One of the things that's sort of very frustrating is how much misinformation is out there. When Ron Johnson first ran for the Senate, he was interviewed on Devil's Advocates and said the average teacher's salary in Milwaukee is over $100,000. Well, you can check that out. It's on the DPI website. And when I checked it out, it's not 100,000. It's a little over 60,000 for 12 years experience and a master's degree. And the entry-level bachelor in business education or in business degree, 15,000 plus bonus. I mean, I think that speaks in a sense to what the priorities are. And I think it's really critical, if we want to survive as a country and a community, that we make the significant investments in their public education that are so critical.
I had a thought. I think this is ultimately the subtext or the overlying theme of every single one of our shows. Why is the right wing trying to destroy public education? It's funny. I think if we read history, public schools were created by the wealthy class so that they wouldn't be robbed by people who were hungry and starving and basically destitute, because there was no actual system of education to be able to create humanity, to create like kind of a moral code and everything. So those that are either trying to enrich themselves, I don't think it's that much, Julie, because I think there's a lot. I mean, I think there's more cynicism, there's more privatization, there's more people that are looking for profit off of our tax dollars. I think that's more.
Yes, there's billions of people.
Anybody, I mean, not anybody. There's a lot of terrible, selfish people at the top of the income bracket, but I think it seems so hard not to understand that if you don't have an educated populace, you turn into a second world, third world country.
Yep.
And it doesn't matter how much money you have, your life isn't that good when everything's falling apart all around you.
I also feel like, go ahead, Charles.
If it works the way it's supposed to, public education can be a great leveler. And that's, I think, what the elite hates about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also feel as though you hear time and time again, and I think we referenced this in the last half hour, where that people are attacking you, Kirk, saying low-income children of color. I feel like they're also thinking that it seems like, oh, look, we like the people of color. We love Black and brown children, Fred. Wouldn't you say they're also like, we're trying to help you. You should be a part of the Republican Party because we can send your kids to private schools.
Yeah, I mean, that's just so disingenuous.
One of the things I think that needs to be understood is that I think a majority of the people enrolled in public schools with the voucher program never went to a public school.
Yes.
It's not like kids failing public school are somehow being rescued. A majority of them never went to public school.
It's completely disingenuous to say that we're taking the rug out from under disadvantaged kids, people of color. Just think about the fact that before private voucher schools existed, we had public schools. So yes, if we win this lawsuit, there will be no more money for 60,000 kids to go to a private school. But they should be able to find a place back in public schools. These kids or their parents can pay for them to go to a private school like they should have been doing all along.
As they did, I'm guessing before. Well, how long are vouchers as a program? Has that even been around since after desegregation, right? After Brown.
Well, they started originally right after Brown versus the Board of Education, when the southern states closed their public school systems, and then they gave people vouchers, and the white kids went to private schools.
There you have it. Just saying.
Educational apartheid. Right. Yeah.
There it is.
Educational apartheid. So we don't have a ton. I don't know what else we want to talk about today, Patty. But I want to ask Julie what we had going on next week. But what do we still have to talk about today for the?
Well, here, I mean, I would say, go ahead, Charles. You wanted to say something, or I was?
Yeah, I was going to say I've been sort of tracking this for a while, and I put together a spreadsheet for every school district in the state, comparing the funding that's provided for public school versus what's guaranteed for a private voucher school. And as I mentioned earlier, there are districts where that difference is in excess of $8,000 per K-8 student. That is just incomprehensible to me, that we should allow that kind of system to survive. Well, you mentioned that this is Underwood versus Voss, and in his district, 63rd,
there
almost every one of the districts, the public school gets less than is guaranteed for a private voucher school. In Yorkville, the difference is $7,362 between what's guaranteed for a private voucher school student and what's provided to the public school.
Charlie,
I don't know how you could justify that.
Charlie, I have a question for you on your data, because you sent me your spreadsheet earlier, and folks who are listening, Charlie did a great job. I mean, he really did the painstaking work of looking at every single school district in Wisconsin and seeing what this differential was, because the math for the school funding in Wisconsin is very confusing. But when I saw this, when you sent me this spreadsheet, Charlie, I saw my entire North Woods of Wisconsin being like getting the rawest deal out of the whole state. So it's like, so people are saying like, this is a Milwaukee issue, but it's not a Milwaukee issue. No. Like if I mean, yes, there may be more different types of private schools or voucher schools and stuff like that in Milwaukee than there are in northern Wisconsin. It's basically Catholic schools are the only private schools you have up there. But it's everywhere. The funding for per pupil funding for kids in public schools in most of northern Wisconsin has fell disastrously more than in places in other parts of Wisconsin. That's why I cared about it.
So Kirk, one other thing about the northern school districts, even districts that don't have students in voucher schools, like some of the northern districts, they still pay for it, because the voucher payments come off of the top. The independent charter school payments come off of the top of the education budget, like a big bucket of money that legislature appropriates. So that money comes off the top before they divide it up to the public school districts across the state of Wisconsin. And honestly, those northern districts are sending money all over the state, and they should be mad as hell. And they should be mad at their legislators for allowing it to happen.
Just imagine.
As Brian mentioned before, it's sort of like a cancer. It's growing, metastasizing in some respect.
Just imagine if I were a Republican speaking in a room full of Republicans, and I said, "Can you believe Milwaukee is taking our tax dollars, our public school tax dollars away from Monaco, Wisconsin? We got to do something about this." I mean, that would be 100% right for any Republican in any way, shape, or form would agree with that, not to give money to the Milwaukee public schools. And that's exactly what's happening, but the Republican Party is for it as opposed to against it, which is
amazing.
The other thing that's an issue, I think, coming back to the question of fairness, how can the state of Wisconsin say to a parent with a kid in a public school that their child is less deserving of state aid than someone in a private school, where that difference in many cases is thousands of dollars difference? I mean, that's mind-boggling.
In some instances now, the vouchers are even greater than the amount of money a school is allowed to spend per student under the revenue limit. So it's not even just the states not keeping up with the state aid payments when comparing the voucher school payments to the state aid payments, but the school itself is not allowed to spend as much as the voucher on the student.
As the voucher payments went up this year, it is possible that there are going to be some school districts who won't get any state aid because of this at all, and it's going to eat into their other state aid too. They're just going to be.
I feel like every week I spend most of these conversations just shaking my head, throwing my arms up, and grateful that we have champions like you who are pushing back on this. So Kirk, Julie, who wants to let me know, let our listeners know, our viewers know what's coming up next week? Julie?
I'll give you that. So
Excellent.
I'm really excited to hear from this Racine area, because Racine has a voucher program of their own. And next week, the mayor of Racine, Corey Mason, is going to be here, and the president of the Racine Teachers Association, Angelina Cruz, is going to be talking about the voucher impact on Racine. And Racine's losing like $38 million a year out of their budget to vouchers.
And how many teachers does that represent?
Yeah.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all, Fred Melms, Julie Underwood, Charles Uphoff, and of course, our fearless leader in this battle against the right-wing war against public education, Kirk Bankstead at Minocqua Brewing Company. I'm going to go finish my Bernie brew. Hold on, what does it say? A lovingly irascible and democratic socialist lager. I love it, Kirk. Thank you so much. We'll be back next Thursday at 6:00 to continue this conversation. Have a great night, everybody. Mike Cree's up next. Thank you, Alejandro and Matt Cummings here at WCPT, and bye to everybody on KTNF 950 AM. Good night, everybody.
You're listening to The Right Wing War on Education, brought to you by the Minocqua Brewing Company.